The winter palace lay under a low, iron sky. Candlelight trembled along marble, throwing the red velvet canopy into momentary flickers that made the gilt seem to breathe. In the room where she had held audiences and commanded fleets, where maps had been spread like a general's chessboard and treaties signed with a flourish, the air smelled of wax and camphor. Servants moved with the hushed, practiced economy of a court that had learned how to contain its own tremors. Outside, the Neva slid gray and cold. Inside, the empire's silence gathered around a single bed. She died, and the rumor began to move like smoke. Before we go on, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and stay with this whole account. What follows will ask you to set aside the most obvious story you think you know. Catherine's death was not, at first blush, a fitting end for a woman who had spent 60 years remaking a state. There was grief, of course. There was ritual, the creak of wooden floors as courtiers filed past, the muffled sob of a palace that had learned to carry its grief with protocol. But almost immediately after the official proclamations, Europe's whispering rooms took on a different task. The rumor, obscene and improbable, leapt the boundaries of language as if by habit. It needed no proof. It fed on astonishment. It fed on an image, a ruler with power so great that her enemies could not envision her within any human limits except the most grotesque. To understand how a calumny like that could outlive a life of policies, correspondence, and conquest, one must follow Catherine's path from a minor German principality to the center of an expanding empire, tracing the alliances, betrayals, and the particular vulnerabilities of a woman who ruled in a man's world. She was born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, the child of an obscure court whose rooms smelled of beechwood and ink rather than lavender and silk. The move to Russia was abrupt and vertiginous. A promised marriage, a baptism into orthodoxy, a new name, a new language to learn with an almost militant appetite. Accounts suggest she threw herself into reading as if into an apparatus for survival. Her letters to philosophers would later become a mark of pride for her admirers and a source of suspicion for her enemies. She read Montesquieu and Voltaire not as curiosities, but as tools, ideas that could be translated into civil reforms and arguments for the legitimacy of enlightened rule. The marriage to Peter, later Peter III, was a crucible. He arrived with eccentricities and a temperament misfit for the throne he would briefly hold. For Catherine, the marriage brought humiliation and a political clearing. Where she had been dismissed, a space opened to ambition. She learned Russian, learned the subtleties of court alliances, courted the friendship of officers and the affection of influential nobles. She cultivated loyalty by rewarding talent, the Orlov brothers, among them, and by making herself useful to those who wished to stabilize an unruly empire. Her coup in 1762 was swift by the standards of dynastic change. It was also unimaginably risky. Historians have long noted the military and administrative underpinnings of the seizure. Regiments loyal to her, promises made and kept, the seizing of key points in St. Petersburg while the old Tsar's circle found itself isolated. Peter died soon after his abdication. Accounts differ on the precise circumstances and on how much Catherine knew or intended. What is not disputed is that the dawn of her reign was marked by the need to justify power as legitimate, to present a narrative of restoration and reform rather than usurpation. Catherine's rule would be defined by paradox. She was an enthusiastic patron of the arts and learning, founding what became the Hermitage, a private, expanding sanctuary of paintings, porcelain, and the idea that culture could be a civilizing instrument for an autocratic state. In the palace salons, she staged a different kind of sovereignty, conversations with philosophers in French, letters exchanged across Europe with luminaries who entertained the notion of enlightened monarchy. She crafted an image of Russia as a peer among European powers, mapping ports and seizing opportunities where others hesitated. On the chessboard of Europe, she played with daring. The annexation of Crimea, the partitions of Poland that rearranged borders and populations, the push toward a Black Sea presence that changed the strategic calculus of the continent. Yet alongside this cultivation of knowledge and expansion lay a harsher ledger. Serfdom hardened during her reign. The Pugachev rebellion tore the countryside and revealed how brittle Catherine's social compact could be. Accounts of the rebellion's suppression are accounts of a state using terror to reimpose order. Set-piece reprisals, public executions, the burning of villages. When she wrote to her correspondents about the need for order and the limits of Enlightenment reforms in a society she perceived as unreformed, there was a hard pragmatism underlying the rhetoric. She believed in enlightened change, but she also believed in the necessity of control. That contradiction would follow her as faithfully as any portrait. Her personal life was another axis where power and perception intertwined. Lovers such as Grigory Potemkin and the earlier Orlovs played political roles as much as they offered intimacy. Gifts were not merely tokens, they could be instruments of patronage, channels for governance. She used favor to bind elites. She used marriage and appointments to stitch a fragile aristo-bureaucratic fabric. It is tempting and easy to reduce her to the scandalized shorthand of woman who loved too freely. The reality was more strategic. Personal networks that doubled as political networks. If the court was a theater, Catherine staged it with intent. Her audiences were not spectacles for private entertainment alone. They were public displays of the new state's taste and discipline. The Hermitage's rooms, the silverware, the mannered conversation in the salons, these were instruments of rulership as much as aesthetics. And yet, the more she cultivated a Europeanized image of rule, the more vulnerable she became to a European public that delighted in imagining the unacceptable about a woman who exercised men's prerogatives. The Pugachev revolt was a moment that exposed a deep truth about power and repression. The rebellion began as a peasant uprising, rallying around a pretender who claimed to be a rightful czar. It moved through the steppe with a raw energy that terrified landowners and city magistrates alike. Catherine's response combined military rigor with brutal punishment. Villages were razed, leaders were executed, and the state's message was unequivocal. Rebellion would not be tolerated. For many, the efficiency of the repression confirmed the necessity of her rule. For others, it stamped her as ruthless. Such ruthlessness fueled narratives that already wanted to paint her as monstrous. The European public, salons set on gossip as much as politics, pamphleteers chasing sensation, diplomats who traded reputations like currency, found in her contradictions the raw material of slander. A woman who wrote to Voltaire about constitutions and who signed decrees curtailing peasant unrest could be recast in rumor as unnatural, as overstepping the boundaries society assigned to her sex. And then there was the succession. Her son, Paul, had a complex, fraught relationship with his mother. From childhood grievances over upbringing and politics to adult resentments over favoritism and perceived slights, Paul's disposition made him a difficult ally and, later, a threat. When Catherine's death left the throne to him, his response to her memory was ambivalent at best. He did not, historians note, mount a vigorous defense of certain reputations. Personal memory and dynastic calculation often overrode any filial instinct to shield a parent's legacy. In that vacuum, the rumor found space to breathe. How does an obscene story gain purchase on a continent? The mechanisms are not exotic. Salons thrived on shock. Pamphlets needed buyers. Diplomats wishing to discredit an opponent's foreign policy or a rival's prestige would not hesitate to add a moral leavening to their political critiques. The horse rumor traveled precisely because it was memorable, because it satisfied a hunger for the grotesque, and because it fit an established pattern of gendered slander. A powerful woman, especially one who took lovers freely and who had shaped policy, was easy to mark as aberrant. There is also the question of logistics and physical possibility. The rumor's specific claims were not only obscene but mechanically implausible. Stables and chambers in the Winter Palace were arranged, stonemasons could attest, in ways that made the central image physically unlikely. Contemporary visitors, diplomats, physicians, servants whose memoirs survive in fragments, offered evidence of Catherine's corporeal reality.
letters and papers that show she moved among rooms, dined, received envoys, and suffered from ailments consistent with the ailments of age. No credible eyewitness account from those in proximity at the time recorded the act as fact. Where salacious claims grow, credible eyewitnesses shrink. That
absence matters. To speak clinically is not to be prudish. It is to insist that reputation ought to be anchored to evidence. The rumor thrived because it offered a compact explanation for what could not otherwise be held in the mind. A woman who had the empire under her hand and who would die without being easily explained. It explained her power by making it monstrous. It relieved people of the harder cognitive work of reconciling intellect with force, patronage with cruelty. As the rumor circulated, courts across Europe took delight. Pamphlets in Paris, caricatures in London, gossip that traveled in diplomatic dispatches. These were not neutral acts. They served political functions. To hold Catherine up as a cautionary tale about female power was to warn other polities away from similar precedents. To mock her was to deflect attention from the policies that men found harder to condemn. The annexations, the legislation that raised new bureaucratic hierarchies, the consolidation of imperial authority. There is no satisfying single moment that explains every motive. For some, the joke was simply a delight. For others, a weapon. For diplomats worried about expansionist designs, for exiled nobles nursing grievances, for journalists and artists seeking headlines, the rumor was convenient. But convenience does not translate into truth. In the years after her death, careful historians and observers began to dismantle the tale, piece by piece. They argued from the physical, palace plans, household accounts, the testimony of servants and foreign envoys who recorded routines inconsistent with the rumor's logistics. They argued from motive, who benefited from the calumny. Often, those who needed to depict Catherine as morally bankrupt were men whose policies she had outmaneuvered, or who feared the precedent of a woman ruling without male intermediation. They argued from character. A ruler who organized the state bureaucracy and patronized the arts was unlikely to court risk in the grotesque for private eccentricity when every public act was itself a demonstration of command. This analytical unraveling did not, and does not, erase the initial damage. Slander is sticky. An image once seen leaves a trace even after the original stain is scrubbed. That is part of the story's cruelty. Catherine's real deeds, founding institutions, corresponding with thinkers, extending the empire's borders, drafting legal codes that attempted imperfectly to modernize governance, were overshadowed in the popular imagination by an image that needed no evidence. To be fair to the European audiences of her day, there was a deeper social psychology at work. The Enlightenment itself was ambivalent. It revered reason and yet often practiced ridicule as a social corrective. The salons that debated rights and sovereignty were also places where gender norms were enforced through wit and rumor. A woman who wielded public authority was an anomaly that demanded, in the minds of many, an explanation. The grotesque supplied one. Catherine's own responses to slander were characteristic of her politics. She did not publicly grovel or plead. She consolidated, she continued to govern. She bolstered institutions that would outlast individual calumny. She poured resources into collections, into the commissioning of histories and portraits that would tell a different story. The Hermitage, for instance, became more than a private gallery. It was an act of legacy-making. Paintings and books, carefully chosen, are weapons in the fight over memory. Yet the state's violence, the suppression of uprisings, and the social immobility that serfdom entrenched are not absolved by culture. They complicate the portrait. Catherine's enlightened pretensions rested on an uneasy compromise. Progress for some, order for others. She corresponded with philosophers and yet oversaw punishments that would shock those same minds. She was progressive in the abstract and conservative in the tools she used to preserve authority. Recognizing this complexity is not exoneration. It is refusing to reduce a political life to either sainthood or monstrosity. There are small human moments that insist on her ambivalence. Accounts suggest that in private she might have been capable of warmth. For protégés, for chosen favorites, for the few who could cross the divide between sovereign and companion. At times, she showed a genuine curiosity about education and reform. At times, a cold calculation in which human lives were variables in administrative equations. The Pugachev reprisals were not carried out in a moment of personal fury alone. They were bureaucratically organized, reflecting a ruler who saw order as the prerequisite for any cultural flourishing. The rumor's endurance tells us something important about how societies remember. Memory is not a neutral ledger, it is a contested terrain. Those with the ability to spread stories, printers, salon habitués, foreign ministers, shape the narrative in ways that outlast the immediate facts. Gendered biases bias these narratives further. A woman ruler who refuses to be domesticated becomes not merely exceptional but suspect. The grotesque story serves to re-domesticate by turning power into pathology. If we strip the rumor of its lurid accretions, what remains is a harder, truer truth. Catherine possessed a talent for statecraft and a willingness to employ ruthless measures. Her reign changed the shape of Eastern Europe, for better and for worse. She expanded frontiers and created cultural institutions. She reinforced servile hierarchies and commanded violent suppressions. Her artistic patronage endures in canvases and galleries. Her political choices endures in maps and treaties. To reframe her legacy is not to whitewash, it is to restore proportion. The horse calumny was a slander that amplified the worst imaginings about a woman who had outstripped the constraints of her time. It was an invention that satisfied a social appetite for spectacle and that served political agendas. It was also, crucially, unnecessary to understand her power. Her policies, her letters, her edicts, these are ample evidence that she was formidable without being monstrous. The impulse to explain magnitude by grotesque detail is a failure of imagination, not a revelation about character. Consider the image of the Hermitage once more. Rooms stacked with paintings, vases, statuary.
Deliberate project of cultural permanence. That is a more lasting portrait of Catherine than any cartoon or rumor. Paintings do not lie in the way gossip does. They are mute records of taste, of networks that she cultivated, of the people she promoted. Long after tongues cease their whispering, institutions persist. They shape the way future generations will imagine power and patronage. When historians sift through archives today, the lesson is methodological as well as moral. They do not treat every contemporary caricature as evidence. They interrogate motive, seek corroboration, weigh logistics. They recognize that scandal often says more about the accuser than the accused. In Catherine's case, the scandal revealed European anxieties about female sovereignty, about imperial expansion, about the inconvenient reality of a state evolving on its own terms. In the end, the rumor's persistence is a caution. It reminds us how readily narrative can outrun evidence, and how gendered imagination can deform public memory. It also suggests an ethical obligation for those who reconstruct the past, to look beyond sensational stories, to trace the institutional traces, to appreciate complexity without surrendering to simplification. Catherine did not need the rumor to be legendary. Her correspondence alone, the maps she reconfigured, the legal projects she launched, the salons she hosted, give a portrait of a woman whose ambitions reshaped a polity. Her life invites us to hold paradox without resolving it into caricature. Admiration can coexist with moral unease. Acknowledgement of achievement can coexist with condemnation of cruelty. When the candles finally guttered in that palace room and the last formalities were observed, Europe had already begun to compose its own story of her. Some told it with malice, some with awe, and some with complicated mixtures of both. The proper historical response is not the simple counter-narrative that replaces one myth with another, but the disciplined attention to records, motives, and structures that produced both achievement and atrocity. The final image is simple and, in its way, stubborn. Beneath the red velvet canopy, amid the brass and silk and the whispered condolences, lay the evidence of a life that had altered maps and households alike. The rumor would survive because rumor survives on sensation, not scrutiny. But beneath the rumor sits a record, not clean, not unblemished, but real, of a ruler who made choices that shaped a continent. If there is a single lesson from this account, it is that power attracts stories, and that stories are weapons as often as they are explanations. Catherine's enemies chose a grotesque explanation because it simplified the uncomfortable complexity of a ruler who belonged to neither saint nor devil, but to both the inventor and the enforcer. To remember her faithfully is to resist the seduction of a single easy story and to hold the contradictory facts together: culture and cruelty, correspondence and command, brilliance and brutality. What happened in the salons and pamphlet presses after her death was not merely entertainment, it was the slow work of
reputational violence. It is our task now, as readers and as citizens of an age that still traffics in quick moralities, to name the operations of that violence and to refuse to let slander masquerade as history. And so the Winter Palace keeps its hush. The paintings in the Hermitage gaze on in a silence that outlives gossip. Maps lie folded in drawers, marking borders that endure and those that do not. The rumor had its moment. The record, when read closely, has the last word. Historians who work most closely with Catherine's papers often speak of a different kind of violence, the attrition of meaning that time inflicts on manuscript and memory. Ink fades, seals break, marginalia are lost to the blunt scraping of catalogers who separate bundle from bundle. What survives is not a coherent life, but a palimpsest. Orders, half-finished drafts, private consolations written and then withdrawn. From this particular detritus, the careful reader must reconstruct intention, pattern, consequence. It is a labor of small, scrupulous gestures, tracing the movement of a signature across years, noting when a phrase reappears in an edict, following a courier's route through towns that no longer answer to the names on old maps. Those gestures are also moral. To read Catherine closely is to meet decision after decision whose effects were lived first by peasants, soldiers, refugees, and administrators, not by abstractions called reform or expansion. Her statutes altered who paid what tax and where. Her decrees determined the fate of serfs in a dozen provinces. Her treaties redrew the lines that shaped lives over decades. The historian who privileges gossip over ledger misses the point that power is exercised most materially in the mundane instruments of governance. A portrait in the Hermitage may attest to taste. A ledger attests to levies. A passport attests to exile. Together they make the architecture of rule. Yet there is another truth, one that resists tidy archival confession. Some of the cruelty associated with Catherine must be accounted for. It can be seen in policies that entrenched inequality, in the harsh punishments meted out after revolts, in the decisions that prioritized state stability over the immediate freedoms of the dispossessed. A careful account refuses either saint-making or demonizing. It holds these facts side by side and refuses the consolations of narrative neatness. That refusal, the refusal to let moral anxiety slip into caricature, is precisely what allows a historical judgment to remain honest and useful. The rumor, however lurid, performed a social service for its makers. It simplified fear.
Stories that reduce an entire political imagination to a single obscene image allow readers to cast themselves as righteous onlookers to wickedness. That temptation is perennial. It reappeared in pamphlets, in theater, in foreign diplomatic dispatches that translated unease about a powerful woman into telltale scandal. Those who circulated such tales were not always fools. Sometimes they were calculating actors who understood how reputations might be weaponized in contests of alliance and
trade. The historian's task is to unmask those motives as readily as to test the stories they produced. Catherine's own voice is the complicating force that neutralizes both slander and sanctification. Her letters are devices of political work, reasoned, supple, often impatient with moral abstraction. In them, one hears an architect of networks as well as a ruler anxious about consequence. She wrote to thinkers who called themselves her friends, and to generals who demanded firmness. She negotiated the demands of Enlightenment rhetoric with the blunt necessities of administration. To read those letters is to encounter a ruler who understood that power is never simply persuasive rhetoric, but a choreography of privilege, force, and patronage. If memory is an arena where reputations are fought over, institutions are the long game. The Hermitage did not exist simply to beautify a palace. It was a public-making apparatus, a way of assembling a state's claims to civilization. Schools, juridical reforms, diplomatic correspondence, all these were means of projecting permanence. They also carry the stains of exclusion. Who was admitted to the salons, whose portraits hung in the gallery, whose voices were written into statute. Paying attention to both inscription and omission is how one resists sentimentalism. What endures, finally, is plural. Visitors still walk the rooms whose silk once muffled state secrets. Scholars still turn brittle pages in archives whose catalogues were compiled by hands now dust. Travelers' tales and satirical etchings have a life of their own, and for many readers those images will remain the first points of contact with Catherine's name. But for anyone intent on responsible memory, the point is not to erase the popular afterlife of rumor, but to place it in relation to documents, contexts, and consequences. Only then can we entertain the full, uncomfortable paradox: a sovereign who did magnificent things and terrible ones, who corresponded with philosophers and crushed insurrection, who transformed maps and left behind suffering. History, in its best practice, does not license moral complacency. It offers instead a method to adjudicate claims, a humility about what can be known, and a readiness to reckon with contradiction. Catherine's life, as patron, legislator, conqueror, and controversial figure, compels precisely this discipline. If the rumor will long outlive the archivist's lamp, it is nonetheless the careful reading of records that supplies us with the firmer foundations from which to judge, to learn, and, where appropriate, to condemn. The last image returns not to a grotesque caricature, but to the quiet insistence of objects that bear witness. A desk with letters, a map folded along the routes imperial troops took, a painting whose sitter looks out as if to measure the future. Such things do not absolve or damn. They ask that we look, that we attend, and that we refuse the easy solace of a single story. In attending, we honor the past not by settling it, but by keeping alive the exacting work of understanding.